Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to the library tour of Doom. Maybe translocated one library over? We're still going through every book, one book at a time. Yesterday we did a very interesting little thing, an anthology by Lynn Carter that's probably out of print, is probably going to stay out of print, and it's probably better that way. And today, there are infinite choices to be made here, but today I thought I would go along the same lines, only in a much greater degree of prominence, a degree of prominence that will never allow it to go out of print, that will never make it hard to find. And that is the works of Robert E. Howard, the Conan stories of Robert E. Howard, particularly in this fantastic centenary edition by Gollancz Press. This is the complete Chronicles of Conan in this big, lovely hardcover. Just fantastic. The only drawback to the whole thing is that the blurb on the back is by Stephen King. But I can live with that, and I suspect a lot of you would like that. It starts off with a map of the Hyborian Age drawn along the lines of Robert E. Howard. And then you have the complete Conan stories. These are all illustrated by Les Edwards, who did not only full-page illustrations, but spot illustrations throughout. So you've got little illustrations to start each story, spot illustrations. Some of you will know that right away. And also full page illustrations. Let me see if I can find one. They're all, as far as I can tell, in pencil, in just unfinished pencil, but they're quite good. So I don't have any problem with that. Of course, when you're looking for there we go. When you're looking for a full page spread, they're going to be hard to find. By random chance, the full page picture that I came across is from perhaps the most famous Conan story of them all. That is from the Tower of the Elephant. That is very stark, and that's probably as it should be. It probably should be very stark considering the story. And this volume takes us through the Conan stories as Robert E. Howard wrote them. And you might think, if you don't know anything about this body of work, about the Conan stories, you might think, oh, so you mean they're not rewritten the way you mentioned Lynn Carter and L. Sprague de Camp would sometimes rewrite or polish over or expand. But it's not just that. They aren't. These are in the pristine condition that Howard wrote them in. For instance, The Hand of Nergal, that Lynn Carter finished, so to speak, in the book we saw yesterday, is here unfinished. It is here just as a fragment. But that's not the only way in which these are just the way that Howard wrote them. They're also just the way he wrote them, in that his Conan led an epic life. And Howard decided to just pop in on that life. When a story idea came to him, he popped in on that life at all of its different periods. Conan was, in his day, everything. A thief, a reaver, a slayer of men, also a leader of men in battle, and ultimately the king of the greatest kingdom in the Hyborian Age. He did all of those things. He was all of those things, starting with being a wolf-like foundling in the snows of the upper north, where the death of such children is a dime a dozen, and no one could have expected that this one large but sulky youth would live to be a pirate, a buccaneer, a master thief, confronting wizards in 10 or 11 different lands on that map we saw. That approach of Howard's underscored the breadth of Conan's life, the breadth of his different experiences, because with a Conan story, you never knew what you were going to get next. You never knew what period you were going to find him in. And Howard wrote that for the pulps. He wrote it that way for the pulps, and that is that. As obviously as you can tell from that description, that approach encourages every story to stand alone. Right? If they're intentionally plucked out of a seamless chronology, then it behooves the writer to make sure that you know exactly where you are in every story. But Howard wrote that for the pulps, and then a little bit after he wrote that for the pulps, epic fantasy, sword and country, sword and sandals, sword and monster, sword and sorcery fantasy really took off in America and the UK. And it was, perhaps to its detriment, more firmly influenced by Tolkien than it was by Robert E. Howard. And one of those influences was meticulous chronology, where you learn exactly what happened, exactly when, all the time. So it struck the sensibilities Tolkien-besotted fantasy writers and fantasy editors a little wrong to present the things like this, to present the Conan world like this, when you could start a series of books with Conan the Barbarian and then go on from there, trying to present these things in a more fleshed out and what's the word I want? Accountable and also chronological manner. And that doesn't happen here either. Here you could, if you know the Conan world, and there's one introductory piece here by Robert E. Howard that isn't fiction. It's just sort of his, I don't know, you would almost call it an essay on world building. And if you read that plus the Wikipedia entry, you'll be all set to jump right into this. And the key to a volume like this, an approach like this, is that you can jump in anywhere. You can jump in with any story. The first story of all is the Phoenix on the Sword, in which Conan is an old man. He went older man, where he is an old king. He is very impatient with kingship. We never see that in the Conan movies. I have said for a long time, it wouldn't be true anymore because time passes. But once upon a time, for 20 solid years, I was saying that the best possible Conan reboot, the one guaranteed to set the franchise on its feet and keep it going. First of all, the best approach for a cinematic Conan universe would be to take this approach. Absolutely, to take this approach. So cast a young actor for a young Conan. Cast a middle-aged actor for a middle-aged Conan. And all through. In fact, since a lot of these stories really stress the fact that lots of people in Conan's lives were seeing a different Conan, even though he would never dissimulate, he would never fake anything. Lots of people in Conan's lives were seeing a very different Conan from other people in Conan's lives. The Norsemen in The Frost Giant's Daughter were not seeing a Conan who was very much like the Amra, the king of the Black Coast pirates. The Conan they knew was more polished, more circumspect, just as savage, but not as raw as that Conan. And so you could, if you were going to relaunch a Conan cinematic universe, cast different actors every time. Wouldn't that be something? Wouldn't that break the grip? One way or another, for like 20 years, I was saying, as the Conan franchise was being stalled, and then Hollywood did try to restart it with Jay Momoa as Conan, and it was a great choice. It's a terrific movie, better than people tend to think. And the whole summer that was out, I was totally on board with saying, yes, let's do this. Let's absolutely do this. And although I don't begrudge Momoa his success as a squintillionaire for Aquaman, I think there are a lot of fantasy fans out there who would agree with me when I say the world needs a really good Conan franchise much more than it needs a really good Aquaman franchise. One way or another. That didn't work. That attempt to restart the Conan franchise didn't work. And for 20 years, I said the way to do it is to cast Arnold Schwarzenegger, who rose to fame and fortune as Conan the Barbarian, as the older Conan in The Phoenix on the Sword. He was, for a long time, perfect for it. I think now he might be a little on the old side. You never know what Hollywood can do, but I wouldn't trust it to costuming or padding or special effects, because like all Conan stories, The Phoenix on the Sword is very raw in its conclusion, very direct and bare knuckled in its conclusion, and you can't fake that. So Schwarzenegger might be too old right now. I don't know for sure, but one way or another, I thought for a long time that would be a great way to do this. I still think that this approach, the approach that Glantz took in this volume, which is dedicated to Karl Edward Wagner and Elsbreg de Camp. No hard feelings whatsoever. This is not the Conan that they presented to the world in a series of mass market paperbacks that won Howard more fans than any other thing. Even the Conan movie. Those paperbacks were responsible for putting this author on the map in the minds of lots and lots of people. If you are used book hunting at your local shop or at a library book sale or whatever, and you come across some of those old mass market paperbacks, they will always say Conan and the Isles, Conan the Buccaneer, Conan the Freebooter, Conan the something or other. If you see any of those, get them. I'm not denigrating them in any way. This is just a completely different approach to the character, and one that I really like. You can do it either way. And this volume itself, in addition to illustrating that approach to Robert E. Howard, also illustrates a little bit of having bookish friends, of this little corner of BookTube. Because I saw this volume when it came to my bookstore. This came out in 2006. And 2006 is right about when I was wrapping up being a bookseller. And we got a copy of this, a couple of copies of this, and it was expensive. I seem to remember that the paperback was $25 or $30, maybe even more than that. And I had cut my teeth completely on both the Elsbreg de Camp Conan volumes and Roy Thomas's Conan in Marvel Comics. I'd cut my teeth completely on those things and thought, well, why? It's a pretty book, very pretty, very nice design, but why do I need another Conan volume, especially an expensive one? And it looked to me like the kind of thing I would never see used. And then years and years and years passed, and YouTube happened, and then BookTube happened, and then I was watching Jason Harrigan's channel. I forget what name his channel had at the time, but I looked over his shoulder and saw this thing on the shelf and openly lusted after it, as we do when you're looking at somebody. Even when you're watching news shows and you see somebody's books over their shoulder in a Zoom chat for MSNBC, you still start lusting over some of the volumes. And I lusted over the volume in his comments field. I said, oh my, isn't that pretty? And typical of this little corner of BookTube, he sent it to me. And then, I think a month later, a year later, one of you, I don't remember who it was, I thank you all the same, sent me a photograph of a big, gigantic haul of books that they'd gotten from their local library sale. You know, the kind of thing where you fill a tote bag for $5 or something like that. And in that haul, the person was offering me, are there any of these you want? And the person in that haul was the paperback version of this, in perfect condition, like it had never been used, like it had never been read. So they sent me the paperback, and I sent the hardcover here to Vermont, to Mark Richardson of Richardson Reads, who has an absolutely beautiful and meticulously, carefully maintained library of hardcovers, mass markets, and stuff like that. And I knew when I was doing it that probably the original sender, Jason Harrigan, who's a friend of both of us, would be perfectly happy with that, as long as the book ends up in a good home. And I didn't need 2 copies at all of this thing. I have a paperback that I go to. Probably, since I don't have those mass market Elsbreg de Camp volumes, I probably go to this more often than I do to any other Conan. When you've got the urge to read something like that, to read Rogues in the House, for instance, I often pull down my paperback more than I do. I have a 3-volume paperback set. I have some mass markets, but and I have a ton of ebooks. But I often go to this one. But that illustrates another aspect of this little corner of BookTube, which is that we're all bookish friends. You know, where there is no. I've had bookish friends that weren't quite on that wavelength, where if they gave you a book, then it was the whole Victorian nightmare. You not only could not ever re-gift it, but it had to be prominently displayed when they come to visit and all of that. Whereas Jason was just happy that this ended up in the hands of someone who loved it just as much as he did and I do. So it was neat to see it here. It was neat to see it in this little book room. And there you go. That is your library tour of Doom for today. I don't know how available this thing is. It seems odd to say that, because in this video I've said that it came to me free twice. But nevertheless, I don't often see it. I never see it used. And yet, that's the being. She's right here in this room with me. She didn't want me to film without her. And I never see it used. And I don't remember the last time I saw it in a new bookstore. But you could do worse. It will be expensive. It will set you back a little bit of change. But you could do worse than to have this as your go-to Conan volume. One of the reasons why I was perfectly okay making the old switcheroo with this hardcover and the paperback, they are exactly the same. The paperback and the hardcover look the same. But one of the reasons I was so happy to do it is because Mark is so much more careful with his books than I am. And I just knew that a hardcover like this would not be treated the way it should be the way it would have been in either Jason's collection or Mark's. It belongs here. The paperback can just take its chances with me. But anyway, if you are a Conan fan, there are worse volumes to have. This is in fact the prettiest and best volume to have of the complete Conan. This is the complete world of Robert E. Howard's Conan. We'll leave aside for the moment all of the knockoff novels. We'll be getting to those. There are a lot of them, and I imagine some of them are here. But in the meantime, that's your library tour of Doom for today. It's Conan by Crom and Mitra. It's a terrific world to enter. Robert E. Howard was not much for internal consistency. He was not a world builder like Tolkien in the sense that Tolkien was. And yet you very much, no matter what story you light on, you very much do get the impression that you are entering a coherent world that is unlike any fantasy world you've ever encountered, despite the fact that because of these stories, you have encountered fantasy worlds like this one many, many times. Robert E. Howard has had, well, I don't know. It's the subject for another long, rambling, late-night discussion with Mark, to wonder who's had more of an influence, Tolkien or Robert E. Howard. I would be willing to bet that even if you can't settle the question of which of them, between them, I'd be willing to bet they leave all other contenders behind. I'm pretty sure that between them, they are the architects of all modern fantasy. It could just be that I'm misrepresenting Howard's effect, because there's a lot of effect of Robert E. Howard in some of this library. We'll get to all of them, but we're going to leave off on Robert E. Howard and the Hand of Nergal does not need to appear in more than 2 videos in a row. So we'll leave off on those and go somewhere else in the next library tour of Doom. And I'll sign off now, and I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.